Before I introduce Jessica, I just wanted to introduce a couple members of Vision 2020. We have a chapter on our campus, and it's the second one in the United States for Vision 2020. And Vision 2020 is a national coalition of women from every state that are trying to achieve economic, political, and social equality by the year 2020 to commemorate the 19th Amendment. So the leaders here today, could you guys stand up? Abby, the blonde, is one of the presidents. Celeste and Kiana are the leaders of this organization on Bay Path campus. And tomorrow, those of you that are students, when you have an opportunity to sign up for clubs, look for their banner and look for one of them to speak to, because this is something all of you should think about joining. Thanks, ladies. One day this summer, I was at Barnes & Noble bookstore, and I was walking around looking for a great book to read. And I happened to catch this book's cover. And what caught me immediately was the coffee stain. And I thought, somebody put the book back after they spilled something on it or they had put a coffee cup on it. And I walked over to the book and I saw the title, Mistakes I Made at Work. And then I saw a further explanation. 25 influential women reflect on what they got wrong, what they got out of getting it wrong. And I said, wow, this sounds like a great book. So I opened up the book, looked at the contents, and looked at the names of the 25 people that Jessica had interviewed. So needless to say, I bought the book, drove home to East Long Meadow, literally sat down and read the book cover to cover. It is so well written, it's so clear and concise, and its message is fantastic. So I finished reading the book, and I pulled out my computer, and I sent an email to Jessica. And I said, hi, I'm Liz Deneen. I teach at Bay Path College. I just read your book. It's fantastic. I wish I read it 20 years ago. Then I said, could you possibly come to Bay Path, since you work at Smith, running the Work and Life Center, and give us an hour and talk about the book and talk about the interviews. Well, I had never met Jessica. I didn't know if she'd respond. And literally 20 minutes later, I got an email back from her saying, thanks for your kind words about the book, and I'd love to come to Bay Path. I've heard wonderful things about Bay Path. So that's how she got here. And I am over the moon that you are here tonight to share your insights with all of us. So thank you so much, and the floor is yours.
Hi, everybody. So I'm so excited to be here. I'm a little nervous suddenly that I'm looking out at real people out there. But I've spent time at Bay Path mostly at your women's conference, the Women's Leadership Conference, which I just love. So it's a real honor to be visiting as a speaker. I'd like to thank Bay Path University, especially Brianna Styler, Director of Special Programs, Liz Deneen, Chair of the Criminal Justice Department, who I haven't read my book and sent me an enthusiastic email that just made my day and arranged for this visit. And also Chelsea Klein, who I don't know if she can make it. I know she has 2 small kids, Director of WELL and Assistant Director of Student Career Services for the American Women's College. And Chelsea's also been a big supporter of the book. So I'm going to speak for about 30 minutes, showing some PowerPoint slides as well. And at the end, I'll have time for questions, and then I'll also be signing books, so we can talk more then too. Since my book is called Mistakes I Made at Work, I'm going to start off by telling you about one of my own mistakes. My background is not in higher education. I arrived at Smith College with a master's degree in elementary education from Bank Street College in New York City and an MFA in writing. I taught and tutored little kids for 9 years, which I really loved, and I was used to colleagues who were 4th, 5th, and 6th graders who, could be difficult, squirming when I was trying to teach them fractions or chewing on their pencils when I was trying to get them to write. But they never started sentences with phrases like, people who are familiar with the scholarly work on this subject understand the complexities of blah, blah, blah. The kids didn't intimidate me, whereas my new colleagues at Smith did. When I had to make presentations to professors, I shook with anxiety, choosing my words carefully, saying things like, the research shows, or some interesting studies demonstrate, because I quickly understood that my colleagues were serious academics and that data ruled. Even so, adrenaline would flood my body in a way that left me breathless. And this anxiety made me do stupid things. One day, early in my career at Smith, I was in my office preparing to attend a meeting with other center directors, and now at this point I was acting director of Smith's Wurtele Center for Work and Life. At the meeting, I was supposed to hand out a proposal for which my boss, the dean of the college, was trying to gain support. It was for a new leadership concentration, and I knew that faculty had some misgivings even about the word leadership, which they associated with imperialism, with patriarchal hegemonic structures, or as I thought about it, with one group bossing another group around. I felt nervous about having to sit with these faculty members, perfectly nice people, and respond to questions about the proposal. Then I got a call from my infant daughter's daycare, saying she seemed under the weather. So here was the pull of maternal feelings. Thinking of my daughter feeling sick made me want to rush to be there for her. But if I'm honest with myself, there was a sense of relief at the chance to get out of this meeting that was making me anxious. So I turned to my assistant, who had recently graduated from college and was new in the job herself. I asked her, could you just go to the meeting and take notes and just give them this so they have it? I handed her the neatly stapled packet of proposals. And my assistant said, okay, because what else was she going to say? And she went to the meeting. The next day, I asked with some trepidation, how'd it go? Of course, I'd had a fantasy that the professors would have quietly accepted the proposal, happy to put it away and talk about it some other time. Well, she said, even though they knew I wasn't there to officially present it, they had a lot of questions and I wasn't sure what to say. I reassured her that I hadn't expected her to answer the professor's questions, and I didn't say anything to my boss, but had a sinking feeling that this had been a bad decision. The next time I met with her, she had heard everything through the grapevine. She was not happy. You sent your brand new assistant to a meeting with other center directors, she said. She just started here. She just graduated from college. That was not good judgment. What were you thinking? What had I been thinking? I don't remember exactly what I told her, but it wasn't, well, I'd been thinking I might do a lousy job of talking about your proposal, and so I was happy to get out of it, and I was really hoping you wouldn't find out. Here's what made me feel even worse. My boss told me, we're going to have to table the whole thing. Faculty already had misgivings, and we didn't get off on the right foot with this. My anxiety about not doing something well had led me to not doing it at all. I was mortified that I'd screwed something up for my boss, a project that had seemed important to her. Now, I know over the years I earned her confidence again, making up for the mistake, and I'm grateful she gave me another chance, many more, and that she believed in me even after I made a bad choice. But I wish I could say to you, and that was it. It was one mistake, and after that, it was smooth sailing. No, I made many more, and I still make mistakes at work. There's a saying in writing workshops, write the book that you want to read. And this is what I did in developing mistakes I made at work. As I made my way up a steep learning curve in higher education, I started to think it would be really comforting to read about other women's work mistakes. I needed these stories, and I knew I wasn't the only one who needed them. Students at Smith talked about being afraid to speak up in class. Everyone around here seems to have something to say, students would tell me, and they say it so well. They talked about a sense that everyone had it together with their internships and research projects. There was a feeling that even in your first year, you weren't doing enough. You were already falling behind. In one of the workshops I led at Smith, a student wrote about this feeling by saying she was trapped by these constant expectations and pressures, by needing to live up to multiple personas, feeling the need to satisfy everyone. She wrote, you find yourself always trying to find the right answers, the right behavior, and the right opinions that aren't necessarily yours. I would imagine that students here sometimes feel the same way. Research shows that these kinds of feelings play out among women at many colleges and universities. Students at Duke and more recently at Princeton showed that young women felt the need to do everything well to be, quote unquote, effortlessly perfect and to measure up to an impossible standard. A Barnard College senior named Julie Zellinger published a piece on Forbes.com called Why Millennial Women Do Not Want to Lead. And she wrote, young women today are bred to doubt ourselves, question our worth, and view ourselves as improvable projects rather than embrace the imperfection of our humanity. Her piece received almost 80,000 page views and was shared on Facebook almost 10,000 times. Clearly, it hit a nerve. And I agreed with Zellinger when she said we need to be able to embrace our own imperfection in order to put ourselves out there as leaders. All the research on leadership shows that people who rise to top positions are people who are able to be resilient in the face of mistakes. They're able to fall down, get back up again, learning what there is to learn. And I felt like this wasn't really being modeled by women for women. Right after I got my job as director of the Wurtele Center, I was encouraged to attend this high-level women's leadership conference. So at the end of 5 days together, the other participants and I gathered in a formal space on campus to listen to stories and advice from several women at the top of their fields. The panel moderator asked these women, can you talk about a mistake and what you learned from it? And of course, I listened carefully, waiting to hear stories that would be comforting to me, but they never came. These women said things like, oh, it is so important to learn from your mistakes. And truly, we learn more from our mistakes than we do from our successes. But these were platitudes. They weren't comforting because looking at them in their well-tailored suits with their confident demeanors, you could easily think they've never made mistakes like the ones I've made. Several months later, it happened again. There was a panel of top women in government, part of a collaboration among several women's colleges. I was watching on live stream from Northampton, and first Hillary Clinton spoke, introducing the event, and then a former congresswoman got up to introduce the panel, and her very first question was, can you talk about a mistake you've made at work and what you learned from it? Again, I sat with my pen poised, waiting to take notes, but one panelist, a woman whose background was in the military, essentially said, we don't make mistakes. Another talked about her college career, saying, I wish I'd studied economics. Of course, they'd been put on the spot in front of well-respected peers, so it made a certain amount of sense that they were buttoned up, not willing to make themselves vulnerable. Still, hearing both of these panels drove home to me that stories about mistakes at work were missing from the public discourse on women, work, and leadership. I pulled together what I needed to write my book with the help of an agent who, by the way, had gone to a women's college and totally got the project. And the amazing thing is that when you tell people that you're writing a book, sometimes they're willing to talk to you. So I became like the conduit for these amazing stories of mentorship from these women who agreed to be interviewed. So I'm going to share with you the top 3 lessons that resonated with me personally based on the interviews that I did. In my son's first grade, they studied people called great changers, people who make a difference in the world. And I think of Rinku Sen as a great changer. She's on the forefront of the racial justice movement, and she's extremely creative and brave. I'll just give an example of what she's done in her job as director of the organization Race Forward. She thought that news outlets should stop using the word illegal and illegals to describe people who were immigrants to the United States. She wanted to erase these words from the public discourse on immigrants, so she started a campaign called Drop the I Word, and everyone thought she was totally crazy. But because of this campaign, the Associated Press in 2013 announced it would no longer use the term illegal to describe immigrants, which was huge because a lot of news sources around the country are guided by Associated Press style or AP style, as you may know. So it was a major victory, pretty amazing. And she's gotten fellowships and awards. Her work has been on ABC and MSNBC. She was named one of Ms. Magazine's 21 Feminists to Watch. All around, pretty awesome. But long before all the awards and prizes, when Sen was 23, she became the co-director of a place called the Center for Third World Organizing. And she told me this story about a mistake she made. Rinku Sen and her co-director hired a 21-year-old intern who, like Rinku, was a woman of South Asian descent. Rinku thought things were going along just fine. She assigned projects to the intern and supervised her as she completed them, making sure the intern was doing a good job. Then the internship ended. Before she left, the intern sat down with Rinku and told her she'd been a disappointment, that she hadn't met her expectations as a South Asian woman mentor. This made me feel terrible, Rinku told me. And looking back, I know that I didn't react well. I said something dismissive and that shut her down on the spot. I remember thinking, that can't be true. I did everything I could. It's her fault. So raise your hand if you've ever heard feedback and felt defensive. Think about, was it at home or at work or at school? And now raise your hand if you've ever taken the time to reflect later on which parts of the feedback might have been valid and which weren't valid. So, this is a really important part of developing as a leader, the ability to have that self-awareness about your own part in an issue with any colleague. And I think it's really hard to do. Sen says that looking back, she knows now that this young woman just really wanted a more personal mentoring relationship, and Sen wasn't ready for that. She was only 23. These days, if criticism upsets her, she has a couple of strategies. She says, when someone's criticizing you, don't check out or dwell on defensive thoughts like, she can keep talking, but it's not affecting me. Keep your reaction minimal and ask for more details. Do some soul searching and figure out, what is this person saying that I really need to own and change? She also says, we often think everything has to happen right now, especially when we're churned up emotionally, but it doesn't. And she suggests this language, which I think is really useful. I'm really feeling what you've just put in front of me, and I would like to take a minute to process it. Could we talk again in a half an hour, or tomorrow, or next week, or next year? But I think this is really good advice. It's in the book. But what was especially brave about Rinku Sen in her interview with me is that she also told me a very recent story about dealing with criticism. So she talked about having led a racial justice training in a format she'd used before, and this was just a couple of years ago. Now, usually people love her trainings. If you go on her website, you see these testimonials about her incredible facilitation and her expertise in guiding a group. And people say after her workshops, you changed my life. This is the best training I've ever attended. But after this one particular training, she got terrible feedback. Participants said she was insensitive, that she seemed distracted and snappy. One person even said, she can't facilitate large groups. Of course, Rinku felt absolutely terrible. She told me, I immediately wanted to do things to fix the situation. I imagined writing a long email explaining myself or asking a colleague to talk to the client on my behalf. But that's not what she did. Instead, she called a close colleague, and that person was able to help her get some perspective by asking, what are you most worried about in the feedback? Is there a way to get more information? This person reminded Rinku that people have off days, and somehow Rinku did keep herself from stewing over it too much. Instead, she came up with a plan. She scheduled a call with the client, and she realized as she talked that she had been a little distracted on the day of the workshop, and she realized something that she already knew but maybe needed to be reminded of again, which is that because talking about racial justice is so charged, she always needs to be fully present as a discussion leader, and she decided that in the future, if she was feeling distracted or overwhelmed, going into a workshop, she'd ask for help. So she wrote a note to the group she led, thanking them for their feedback and saying she'd taken it seriously. And she offers this advice in any work situation: slowing down and being reflective before a tough conversation can make all the difference. Having the discipline to not be defensive shouldn't be confused, though, with unnecessarily taking responsibilities. The reason you don't want to react in the moment is so you can gather more information about this situation, determine what's mine to take on and what's really not. Daniel Goleman, who is an internationally known psychologist, some of you might be familiar with his work, writes about great leaders demonstrating a thirst for constructive criticism. In order to be thirsty for criticism, you have to be self-aware enough to check your reaction when someone criticizes you. And Rinku practices self-awareness quite purposefully. So to me, the important takeaway is that you need self-awareness to self-regulate, which allows you then to take in criticism, to evaluate your own performance, and to get perspective on a difficult situation. But it's something you can develop over time, and sometimes you have to relearn it. The idea that we can learn even really hard things over time if we're willing to is another lesson that stays with me. And the next story I'm going to tell is Cheryl Dweck. She's a Stanford psychologist who's done research specifically on this idea. So has anyone read the book Mindset? It's really good. Yeah, a few people. It's a good book. It was a bestseller. I think it's been published in 21 languages. So Carol Dweck is one of the world's leading researchers on motivation. She's also the author of Mindset, and she studies the ways in which our beliefs about our abilities affect how and what we learn. And it all started because of her own worry that even though most people saw her as a smart person, she always felt at risk of losing that smart person status. In graduate school in the late 60s, Dweck began taking psychology classes with a famous professor named Seymour Saracen. He was unique at the time because he applied his research to real-life problems in children's learning and educational change. And she took several courses with him and thought he was the greatest. Then one day she was sitting in her advisor's office, and he said to her, "I've had this conversation with Seymour Saracen, and he told me he thinks you're really, really smart." And she was thrilled. She just sat there basking in his approval. She felt great. But after that moment, she never took another class with Seymour Saracen. In fact, she avoided him for the rest of her graduate career. Does anyone have any thoughts about why she might have done that? She was worried that if she spent time with him and didn't come off as brilliant, that he'd no longer think she was special, and she didn't want to lose that. When she told me this story, she said that now, looking back, she sees it as a real shame because she was so interested in the kinds of work he was doing, and she really robbed herself of the chance to be mentored by someone she greatly admired. Now, the irony is that in Dweck's research, she was starting to look at how people cope with failure. In our interview, she told me, "I hadn't yet realized that this work was me-search, research that was compelling because of my own experiences and issues." And she said, that's Carol Dweck, she said, "I had never really failed, but when you're a person who wants to be perfect, who wants to be validated, the specter of failure is always there." So I'll tell you a little bit more about her me-search. She gave fifth graders different kinds of problems, puzzles that she could make easier or harder. And when some kids got puzzles they couldn't solve, they stopped working and said, "I can't do this." They thought the failure meant they had no talent. Others said things like, "This is my favorite kind of test." They actually revved up their energy and taught themselves new ways of approaching the problems. Difficulty motivated them, and sometimes they solved problems that were actually supposedly beyond their ability level. So she wondered, why did some kids see failure as meaning they lacked ability, but others saw it as an exciting opportunity to learn? These kids were equally capable, the kids they were testing, but some just wanted to validate their abilities through solving the puzzles correctly, while others wanted to grow or increase their abilities through trying. Maybe, Dweck thought, ability itself had different meanings to these kids. Those who just wanted to validate it were seeing it as a fixed thing. You show your ability to the world through your performance, and the world passes judgment, tells you whether your ability is high or low. But those who want to grow their ability saw it as much more dynamic, as something that could be developed. Now, the received wisdom at the time was that ability was static when she was doing her research in the 80s and 90s. You could look at kids' IQ tests, people thought, and get information about just how much they'd be able to do and how far they'd go. And Dweck was challenging that. She knew her ideas might not be accepted, and she was exposing herself to failure for the first time. What would failure mean? Well, first she was worried about losing her status in the academic community, which was pretty high. She was also worried she wouldn't be able to publish this research so easily, and because it was very new, and that made her worry for all the graduate students who were doing their research with her, who needed to publish to get jobs. At the same time, she believed in what she was doing and knew that in order to grow professionally and personally, she'd have to take a risk and pursue it. And her own theory, she says, helped her to take this risk. So as her research began spelling out the characteristics of fixed mindset versus growth mindset, she started to see the ways in which these insights could apply to her. So she says, when you have a fixed mindset, you value looking smart over learning. You think effort is bad because if you have a high ability, then you shouldn't need to make a lot of effort. You think failures define you. In a growth mindset, you value learning and effort, and you see mistakes and setbacks as tools for learning. Those who believe their intelligence and talents can be developed take on more challenges, bounce back from setbacks, and often achieve more. And when people are taught this growth mindset, their resilience and achievement are boosted. So this theory and these discoveries were almost like a roadmap for Dweck and something she used in forging ahead with her research. And she told me that if she found herself thinking, no, I don't want to do this, this is too hard, she just told herself, no, you have to do it. And I think that her theory is really useful for anyone who wants to grow in any way. So the idea of having a growth mindset is something I think about all the time, and it really helps me. For example, I grew up in New York City, and I hardly ever drove. And then I moved up here, and I had to drive because I had to get places. Excuse me. But I still was kind of nervous about driving on highways. And then I published this book, and I had to drive to Maine because I was invited to Maine. So it really helped me actually to sit in a car and think, I can get better at driving by practicing it. Driving is something I can learn. And, a growth mindset is very helpful in a career, too. For example, I told the story at the beginning of my talk about not being comfortable presenting ideas to faculty, and this is something I've had to practice. So sometimes I've walked into meetings literally with my heart pounding, but I've told myself, this is good. It's good for me that I'm nervous because it means this experience will help me to grow. So my second big takeaway is that each of us should try to have a growth mindset at work. So what do you have a growth mindset about? Just think to yourself. Maybe it's driving, maybe it's cooking, maybe it's a class that you're taking, learning a language. You can get better at it through practicing it. And then here's an interesting exercise. Could you take that same attitude and apply it to a different challenge, a place where you feel more stuck and maybe have more of a fixed mindset? Could you think of that thing as something that could be learned? I think this is a really important leadership skill, the ability to have a growth mindset and even to reframe problems that you're having so you're able to approach them with a growth mindset. Finally, I want to talk about bravery. People who have read this book have often said that it's both comforting and inspiring. So it's comforting to know you're not the only one who's made mistakes at work. Other people are in the same boat. And the inspiring part, I think, has to do mostly with how brave these women are in pretty much every story, but I'm going to give you just some snippets here. So there's Carla Harris. She's a Wall Street mogul who misunderstood an assignment when she was just starting out and lost some of her firm's money. Even after she'd apologized to her boss, a guy at her firm, and it was probably mostly guys, a guy at her firm went around for days and days saying, wow, can you believe it? Oh my gosh, we're still losing money on that transaction. Boy, that was really costly. I don't think I've ever seen anything like that in my career. Finally, after a couple of weeks, she got tired of it. She took him into a room and said, you've always been very supportive of me, and I know you want to see me do well. I just want to let you know that I understand the significance of this mistake. I learned from it, and I understand it was expensive. You don't need to keep talking about it, and I'm sure I won't hear from you about it again, right? That was the end of that. She was brave in confronting her colleague and in somehow figuring out how to do it in a pretty collegial way. There's Cheryl Strayed, best-selling author of the novels Torch and Wild, which is about to come out as a film starring Reese Witherspoon. For a while, she also anonymously wrote a very popular advice column called Dear Sugar, which then became the book Tiny Beautiful Things. And Strayed told me, doubt is part of the writer's life. Every time my Dear Sugar column would go up on the web, I'd wonder, is this one going to be the one that makes everyone say, you suck, you're terrible? With both Torch and Wild, when I sent them off to my editor, I was sick with fear and anxiety and uncertainty. Cheryl Strayed is brave in being able to sit with the doubt that every writer faces and in being able to put her words out there into the world. And there's Anna Holmes, the amazing founding editor of Jezebel.com, who told me about having agreed to sign on to co-edit Jezebel with a friend. The friend then decided she was sick of New York and wanted to move back to London and wasn't going to edit the site anymore. Holmes told me that the people who'd hired her said, okay, then you're going to do it on your own. She said, suddenly my name was going to be on the top of the site. Whether it succeeded or failed, that was going to be on me. I agreed to continue with the job on my own, not thinking I'm going to do a courageous thing, but thinking this is blanking scary. So she was obviously brave in taking the helm of this new site before blogs were even a big deal. And when she knew that the success of it was just up to her, she didn't walk away. So that's my third big idea. There are a lot of ways to be brave, and I think we often don't give ourselves credit for the ways in which we're brave at work. And maybe it's in a difficult conversation, having a difficult conversation with someone like Carla Harris did. It might be sending off writing that you feel invested in, like Cheryl Stray did. It might be forcing yourself out of your comfort zone and into being in charge, like Anna Holmes did. And maybe it's something else. So I just invite you to take a moment and think of a time in the past year when you've been brave and just recognize it. Whether it was at work or at home, when you were doing that, even if it was blanking scary, you were honing an important leadership skill. So I'm going to leave time for questions. So I'm basically going to end here, but I think there's other advice in the book, many pieces of good advice, but I think that three main ones are important. Cultivate self-awareness, try to have a growth mindset, be brave. Know that if you're brave, you're going to make mistakes, and that dealing with the mistakes will require more bravery, and know that you're not alone. And now I'll take questions. So be brave, ask questions.
So I haven't gotten a chance to read your book, but I'm super interested in, I can never pronounce her last name, but I believe her first name's Luma.
Oh, Luma Muffla?
Yeah, the coach of the Fugees.
Mm-hmm.
I guess my question kind of ties into that and soccer. Talking with her, I'm sure that you heard about soccer because of her job. But how do you have, I guess, any experience with how all of these mistakes at work can be avoided or learned through soccer or other activities before you get to the actual workplace, or vice versa, or something like that?
So the question is about Luma Muffla, who graduated from Smith and started the Fugees Family Foundation, fugees.org, which is an incredible organization. It started off as just soccer for kids who were refugees of war, and this is based in Atlanta. And then she decided that she didn't like the schools these kids were attending, so she started a private school, a free private school, just for these kids as well. So now it's both a school and soccer leagues. And she's amazing. She's the real deal. Like, she's so committed. And I'm interested in what you think. I think sports are so important, and there's all this research coming out now about how being on teams, helps women, that women in leadership positions are athletes are overrepresented in leadership positions, that it's really good preparation for becoming a leader. And I was just trying to get my 5-year-old daughter to do soccer, but she was too scared. But what do you think? Do you think that, what kinds of mistakes come to mind? Like, how do you think it's preparation?
So right now, my team is learning how there's 11 people on a field, and it's a pretty big field, so that's each person has to do their own job, and you can't be worried about the fact that other people aren't doing their job or trying to do other people's jobs. If you focus on your job and trust your teammates, then everything gets done. But if you are worried about everyone else's job and not doing theirs, then you forget about yours and you don't do yours to your fullest ability. So it's I guess teamwork pretty much is the generic thing that you can learn from sports or soccer.
Yeah. I think teamwork, and I think there's so much. There's probably a lot of good writing you could do, actually. I'm already imagining your graduate school applications and the ways you're going to connect it to Yeah, I mean, I think that there's a lot that you can learn about teamwork and supporting other people and allowing yourself to be supported. And you also can't dwell on mistakes, right? If you're on the field and you screw up, you can't make that, like, you can't get psyched out because you made a mistake. You have to keep playing and keep doing your best. And just maybe you watch a tape later or you talk with your team, like, what went wrong? How can we fix it? But you can't be like, oh, I suck, because I made a mistake. So yeah, I think there's a lot you can learn. Yeah.
Hi. I
Hi.
have another fun thing to talk about. So I am a chronic perfectionist. I have to be perfect in everything I do, and it really is awful. It's a horrible, horrible, horrible thing to have anyone have to experience. And I was just wondering, like, when you're coming from such a fixed mindset and you're so afraid to let yourself make mistakes, how do you even start to go into being part of this growth mindset? Like, how can you get past that perfectionist ideal that's been ingrained in you for years and years when you just want to be able to take that leap? Like, it's not an easy thing. Do you have any suggestions?
Well, are there areas where when I was asking people, do you have a growth mindset in some area, did you recognize an area where you have a growth mindset?
Sort of afraid of everything, actually.
Uh-huh.
What? Oh, yeah, I did just study abroad, and that was pretty crazy. And, like, with travel, like, I'm really good at, like, growing and experiencing new cultures and things like that. I'm really good at talking to people, but I'm afraid that every time I talk to people, that they're going to realize that I'm not as good as I make myself out to be, and that they're going to suddenly think that, oh, well, you fumbled over your words a little bit. You're clearly not as great as you are making yourself out to be, kind of thing. And I'm stuck in that crippling self-doubt.
Yeah. I mean, I think that it's good you are aware of it. And I think that, you can just start to take little risks in some area that doesn't feel super scary. It's the kind of, I think it's like, some people talk about it like failure is like a muscle. Like you have to practice failing and, figure out some arena where you feel comfortable, like, like doing some kind of sport, for example, where, you're not good at it, or, doing more travel, or, putting yourself in contexts like on campus or maybe in the community where now that you're back from being away, you have to practice speaking the language you were speaking when you were away, if that's possible. I think that's a great way to practice having a growth mindset and just like talking to yourself, like being, there's a woman who, I think she's spoken at Bay Path and she works with us at Smith, Rachel Simmons, and she has this idea, the BFF voice, like the best friend voice, that you should talk to yourself like you would want your best friend to talk to you. And I think that's really good advice to try to just be supportive of yourself.
Awesome. Thank you.
Yeah. Oh, one more question.
So I know you talked about being nervous a lot and like afraid to make mistakes, and this kind of maybe similar to her question, but with interviewing these ladies that you knew like came from like such professional backgrounds, and like how did you kind of gain the courage and get yourself to not necessarily be nervous to like interview them?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I was nervous every time. I mean, I was like, oh, I have another interview. It felt exhausting that I was going to have to like, I don't know. There was a woman who was a professor at Harvard, Lonnie Guinier, who's in the book. And like I was so happy that she agreed to be interviewed, but then I was so scared because she's Lonnie Guinier and she's a big deal law professor. And I usually really enjoyed the conversations once we were talking, even really soon, but I was always nervous before. And it's just, I don't know, it's like you just have to force yourself. I just forced myself to do it. Yeah, and I think sometimes you just have to do that, like force yourself to do things that are scary. it's good when you have a book contract, because then you have to, giving yourself, putting yourself in situations where you have a deadline, you just have to do it, I think is good.
What was your criteria for asking? How did you come up with your list?
Yeah. I really wanted to have women in diverse fields and from diverse cultural backgrounds. So that was big. I had a lot of different lists. I mean, a lot of people said no also. I asked a lot of people who didn't end up in the book. So I kind of eventually, some of them were people like Cheryl Strayed. I read her book, Wild, which I don't know if you've read, but it's so good. I loved it. And I just thought, I'm going to ask her. So I contacted her editor, and she wrote back to me. So I had no connection to her at all. She just agreed to do it. And then there were people who were Smith women who, I tried to find, there's 6 Smith women in the book. And so, and I think, I was hoping that people who had gone to Smith would feel like they wanted to support the project. And some people did, and some people didn't. And I gradually kind of figured out that people who are interested in women's mentorship anyway were more likely to say yes. So as I got towards the end and I'd asked so many people, it started to be like this woman, Reshma Sujani, who started the organization Girls Who Code. I read in the blog The Glass Hammer an interview with her and her talking about failure. So I thought, okay, she's someone who's comfortable talking about this. I'm going to try to see if I can get in touch with her. So yeah, it's kind of veered that way by the end. Yeah, hi.
My name is Shay, and I wanted to know, I always wanted to write a book, not like a fictional book, but like a self-help type book, and I wanted to know, did you come across roadblocks other than the lady saying no while you were going along? Did you feel like this book wasn't going to happen, and how did you get over that, and how did you actually complete the book?
Well, as I was developing it, first it was going to be essays, and through friends, I found an agent who was supportive of the project, and so she said, yeah, put a proposal together. When you put a proposal, in this case, since it was going to be essays, not originally, she was like, gather the essays, and then maybe I was supposed to write something, and I think that's when I thought it wasn't going to happen before we sold the project, and I was kind of relieved. I was like, maybe this won't happen. Maybe I won't have to do it, because it was a little scary. So I wanted to do it, but I was also scared of doing it. And then once I got the book contract, I had 9 months to finish it, and I knew it just had to happen. I mean, I was scared. It was really a lot of fear motivated me to finish it. So at that point, I was just like, I have to do it. I have to start doing these interviews and contacting people. And I guess there was this background anxiety, if I don't do this, it won't happen. But once I got going and I had found someone to publish it, I knew it was going to happen. But I think, there's been other things I've sent out. I wrote some children's books that got sent around. No one wanted to publish them. I think that's the thing with writing. There's a lot of rejection with writing, and even with nowadays, it's good to have an agent to sell your project. So even getting an agent, there you can have a lot of rejection, but it's always good to get, I think, a lot of feedback from people if there's something you're working on, and it's really nice to have collaborators. Sometimes people write a book, with a partner. So, yeah.
So you mentioned that you got your MFA. Would you, I think the question would be twofold, but would you recommend people who want to write to get their MFA? And also, would you write a book that would maybe be more based on your experience next time?
Maybe. I mean, I would, yeah, I might. I've thought about that. And, you know, I guess an MFA, it's really hard. I would say, like, you know, the MFA is really good for learning to deal with failure, actually, and like learning to revise, and because you get a lot of feedback on your writing, and it's time that's just for you to work on your writing. So that's really special if you can find the one I did was at Hunter College in New York City, and it was all evening. So a lot of people had jobs. I worked during the day, and I went to classes at night, and I really loved it. I mean, it's kind of an indulgence in a way. Maybe for some people it feels like this urgent thing they have to do. For me, it just felt like it was something I really wanted to do. I felt lucky that I got into this program and I could go, and it was like time to just focus on my writing for 3 years. And I think I became a better writer. There's a book that came out, I don't know if you've heard about it, called New York City or MFA. It's like all these writers like arguing over whether you should just have life experience to learn to be a writer or go to an MFA program. And I think there's a lot of disagreement about that, but I think also there's a lot of programs now that like you can go for free. Like you can go like live in Georgia and teach, and they let you go to the program for free, and it's really cheap to live there. And so I think that's like especially good if you can go to a program for free. Any other questions? No. Well, thanks everybody.